Hi, I'm Alise Chaffins, and I'm here today with Dr. Erin Macdonald, an astrophysicist, an author, and an educator who's an advisor for Star Trek, and as well as the Amazon Prime show Space Cadet. She's also the producer for IDENTITEAZE, the new film from YouTuber Jessie Gender. Thank you so much for speaking with me today, Dr.
Yes.
Erin.
Thank
Yeah.
you for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Absolutely. I mean, just right out of the gate, what drew you to astrophysics? Yeah.
I mean, I've kind of come full circle because I first wanted to be a scientist because I watched The X-Files growing up and I was obsessed with Dana Scully, coolest woman to ever exist. And also, I loved the film Contact with Jodie Foster, who played Dr.
Mm,
Ellie Arroway. And that was sort of that first bug of like, oh, astronomer is a job. Like you could study space. That can be your
mm.
job. And so that kind of put that bug in my brain and kind of just kept me going through my careers. And I just loved the idea that I could go to university and just study space for years. And I love that.
Yeah. I think we see a lot of people who go into STEM, especially like space related things, um, who were inspired by people like Carl Sagan and, more recently Neil deGrasse Tyson, stuff like that. Would you, how do you feel as maybe somebody who could be that for a next generation of, astrophysicists?
I mean, it would be a huge honor. I think it's important to have that diversity in front of you and see what you can do when you see people who look like you. And for me, one of my favorite things to do is when I go to a school and they hear that like Dr. McDonald is an astrophysicist and they don't expect a woman with like dyed hair and tattoos to come in. And I think you see kids kind of perk up because it's rewiring their brains a little bit into what being a scientist looks like. And so yes, any opportunity I have to help teach science, to make science more accessible. I was so grateful that like Paramount and Star Trek, we did a series of YouTube videos that was like the science of Star Trek. And yes, so any opportunity, that's a huge dream of mine.
Yeah, for sure. So, how did you kind of make the jump into working as a science advisor for Star Trek and Space Cadet and stuff like that?
Yeah, it's not a it's a weird job in the sense that it's not a job that you see advertised,
Right.
right? Uh, I I went through academia. I love science fiction. I loved teaching. I left research and I was continuing to teach, but teaching didn't pay the bills. And so I went into aerospace engineering, but I missed teaching so much that I was going to these sci-fi conventions and I started giving panels on like physics and Star Trek. Like, let's talk about how warp drive works. Let's talk about this stuff. And they were hugely popular. Like this intersection of sci-fi fans and just people who are interested in science really kind of came together. So I did those for a number of years. I still do them. And then I had the opportunity to move to Los Angeles, which as a TV and film nerd, I was like, yeah, I want to be closer to all of this stuff. And I'd met so many people on the convention circuit that were writers or actors or creatives in a sense that they had a project or they knew people who had a project. We're just like, hey, do you want to look at this? And I'd met people who had been science advisors, so I knew that that was a job that you could get. So it really was a matter of just kind of meeting people and getting attached to projects. And I got onto Star Trek's radar through my convention talks. They heard about my physics of Star Trek and they brought me on to their licensed events. And then when they were wanting to hire a science advisor for season 3 of Discovery, I was on their radar and got the job. And then kind of went from there. I'm in LA. They
Yeah,
have a ton of shows being greenlit. And they were like, it makes sense to have one person kind of manage all the science. So yeah.
that's so exciting. And yeah, excuse me. So I understand you've also like done voice work for some other things. Can you talk a little bit about that? And like, yeah, again, that's just such an interesting like career path. Yeah.
Thank you. So the voice acting is weird because I've been doing it for years, even back when I was a researcher, because I got through my PhD and I realized I had not spoken to a non-scientist in like 5 years. It's like, I gotta get out and I gotta start doing other things. And I like being on stage. Had used to be a dancer, and I wasn't really in a space where I could be a dancer again. So I found an acting class, and it was an acting class for adults, and I took it. I loved it and continued to take classes. I am also covered in tattoos, as I mentioned, and so doing stage work or on camera work was a little bit out of the cards for me just because of that. And so I started doing voice work and just fun projects as a hobby, doing audio dramas or narrating independent audiobooks and those sort of things. And I continued doing that all the way to moving to LA, that, I got a couple commercial gigs, and then this opportunity came up where the Hagemans for Star Trek Prodigy knew how much, like, obviously the show meant to me. And in particular, the character Rock Talk, who's a little girl who wants to be a scientist. And so they, at the end of season 1, were like, well, she has to meet Dr. Erin at Starfleet Academy. So let's get you in there. And that was one where it was like, I did all the recording. I saw my animation. I was not going to believe that it was going to make it in until I saw it on screen.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so exciting. Yeah. So, kind of shifting gears a little bit. Excuse me. You just recently produced this film, Identities, with Jessie Earl. Can you talk a little bit about how you got hooked up with her, and
Yeah.
yeah, kind of what drew you to that project?
Definitely. So I started my company, Space Time Productions, just to kind of manage all my consulting stuff, like all my entertainment industry work. And when I was talking to friends, kind of, when we're in that vaccination stage of the pandemic and our bubbles are starting to kind of branch out a little bit, we were talking about how we want to take more ownership of our own careers. Like, we are in a position where we're smart people. We've done the gigs, like we have the credentials, we're waiting for the phone calls. And so it's like, let's just make our own stuff. And
Mm.
so I had been a manager in engineering and in research. I was like, I'm pretty sure I can produce a film. If I can get a satellite launched, I can produce a film. And, like, and I want to do it right. Like, I want to learn the proper process of going through permits and insurance and all of this other stuff. And so I went into that producing mode. I made that first short film with my friends, and then we were literally a week before shooting that I was speaking at Star Trek Mission Chicago, which was a Star Trek convention. I got to meet Jessie Earl, who's known more online as Jessie Gender on YouTube. And we got to meet in person for the first time. And we were sitting and talking, and I was telling her about this film that I was making. And they were like, I have this film I've been wanting to make for a really long time. Like, I think we vibe. Do you want to talk about it once you're done with yours? And so, yeah, as soon as kind of the first film was out and out to festivals, Jessie and I reconnected, and we got it made. And it's out and it's available streaming on Nebula. But just to kind of recap, I think what's most important for me and the joy I get out of making these is telling LGBTQIA stories in the sci-fi space, because I
Mm.
feel like that's an intersection that we don't get to see much of outside of like metaphor. But I want to tell actual like love stories in a sci-fi space with characters in that community. And what's been wonderful is to create that both in front of the scenes and behind the scenes. We have majority LGBTQIA crew. We all wear pronoun pins. It's a bunch of trans creators, a bunch of queer creators of all shapes, size, colors, everyone. And it's just being able to create that set and that welcoming, safe environment is just such a joy for me. I get so much pleasure out of that. So, yep,
Yeah.
2 down. We'll see what's next.
Yeah, it's really exciting. I know I mentioned to one of my kids, we have a Wednesday night dinner, and mentioned, the identities, and they were talking about how excited they were, for that film. And, they have a Nebula subscription and everything. And
Fine.
they're really excited to, take a look at that and everything. So, yeah. So if you were talking to a kid who was, enjoyed sci-fi, enjoyed all this stuff, and was kind of thinking about making a move into STEM in some capacity, what kind of things would you encourage, especially like a elementary or younger kid, to start looking at, to be able to make that transition?
I would say, It's not easy. Like, science is hard for a reason. It's
Yeah.
rigorous. There are processes to it. And it's not always necessarily taught well at that early stage. And it's very easy to have one teacher derail your entire passion for science. I had that with biology. I originally wanted to be like an exobiologist for a brief period, as we all do, right? Like 14 years old, it's like, I'm going to be an exobiologist. And then I had one bad biology class, and it was like, well, I guess I'm not going to do that. And so I think what's so important is, like, if you do have things at your core, like in my core, I loved space. And so just consuming anything that had to do with that, going to museums, watching science fiction, like any of those things that got me excited about the idea of studying space is what kept me going. And for me, I think it's going back to those inspirations, those things that made you excited about it in the first place, and not losing sight of that. I never really had like a mentor myself going through that career, but I had my fictional characters. And
Mm.
every time I wanted to give up on my PhD, because I didn't want to necessarily be a professor, I just enjoyed doing the research. And so there were so many times where I was like, why am I putting myself through this? I would watch Star Trek Voyager, and I would see Captain Janeway and just be like, oh, I can't disappoint her. Like, I have to keep going. And I think that's a valid mentor to have. Like, that does
Mhm.
play the role that you need. And so for kids, I think just continuing the enthusiasm and having representation and being able to talk to people who do it and stay excited, don't let the haters get you down. That will keep you going through it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, who would you say are some of your, like if you're looking and somebody's wanting to like get into some kind of sci-fi show, obviously Star Trek usually is kind of the gold standard of, the most scientifically accurate with, fictional elements in it. What are some other things that you might like point kids to as just, or even just for fun, you know?
Yeah, in terms of like using this, getting into science through science fiction, you
Right.
mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, Star Trek's great. Every kid should watch Star Trek Prodigy. It exists now. Go watch it. Like,
You're
I
right.
can't say that enough. Every adult should watch it. It's a perfect show that I love with my core. Um, but yeah, I think, there's even shows like Camp Cretaceous, that's out where kids are in Jurassic Park, which I can't believe exists, but that is a show that exists. Or things like, Voltron, Legendary Defender, like the Netflix series. Those are all just fun kids shows that do a pretty good job of like making science relatable or having kids characters that are scientifically interested. And so, yeah, just continuing to consume media like that where they can find kids and characters that they can relate to. And I do think there's a lot of it out there. There's just a lot that you kind of have to get through. But yeah, Voltron Legendary Defender would be a big one for me. And then Jurassic Park Camp Cretaceous, mostly because I just think it's really funny. There's a kids Jurassic Park show.
Like, did you read the book? It's not great
Exactly.
for kids. Yeah.
Exactly.
Excellent. All right. Well, I appreciate you taking time to talk with me today. It's
Yeah.
been just a joy. Yeah, I'm so excited for everything that you're doing, and I wish you, yeah, continued luck in all of this.
Thank you. That means a lot.
Yeah, absolutely.